Perfecto. Gracias. So I put it in my pocket here? Oh, yeah, we can hear me.
Uno, dos, tres, ok. Hola, buenos días. Gracias por estar aquí. Hoy tenemos el placer de recibir a David Robert Grimes, que es un científico y autor que tiene un profundo interés en la divulgación y la comprensión pública de la ciencia. Es autor de un libro que se llama Good Thinking, Why Flawed Logic Puts Us All at Risk and How Critical Thinking Can Save the World. Y bueno, este libro lo pueden obtener en Amazon si quieren, y es muy buen libro, ya lo leí, se los recomiendo mucho. Normalmente escribe sobre ciencia, temas de sociedad en diferentes medios, como periódicos como The Guardian, The Irish Times, Scientific American, la BBC, The Atlantic, and Financial Times y el New York Times. Y frecuentemente participa en medios de comunicación de muchas partes del mundo para discutir temas como desinformación en salud y ciencia del cáncer, y también, bueno, es conferencista a nivel internacional sobre la importancia de la evidencia en la sociedad. Y bueno, obviamente la plática va a ser en inglés, pero bueno, quería hacer la introducción en español y por favor acompáñenme para recibir a David a dar su plática.
This one. Gracias. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? So I have to warn you, I am Irish. I am sober, which is rare, for us, but I do speak very fast. So sometimes if I go any way too fast, please just stick a hand up and I'll remember that I'm not in Ireland and I have to slow down a little bit. So thank you for the introduction, Daniela. I'm not going to go too much about who I am because that's already, oh, there we go. This is a musical theater joke we can skip. We've already done this one. But essentially my background, what do I do? As I say to people, I do as little as possible, but make it look like I've done a lot more. So that's my trick. My background is I came from physics and mathematics, and then I went into cancer research and into public health. And I also, as Daniela said, I write for a lot of different publications and I do a lot of other things with the general public. And what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is what is happening in terms of how the public understands science and how scientists have to engage with the public, but also where we go wrong as scientists in the process. So as this talk goes on, I have some bad news. In about 2 hours, a blonde lunatic is going to become the president of the United States for the second time. So we already know things are going badly. Anthony Fauci, who is well known, I'm sure, here as well, has just been given a protective order, a pardon, even though he's done nothing wrong, for doing his job. So we're living in very, very strange times. Your neighbors to the north are a little bit strange. But this is a problem around the world. And we're going to try to talk a little bit why we've been conquered by this kind of populism, misinformation, and disinformation. So hopefully today I'll explain a little bit of that, and maybe we'll have a conversation. And then we can hopefully find some solutions together. So let's try that. So during the pandemic, the WHO came up with a fantastic term, right? They had a portmanteau, infodemic, and they said it was the rapid, far-reaching spread of both accurate and inaccurate information that made it very difficult for people to understand what was truly happening and what was false. And during the pandemic, we had so many examples. Who remembers at the very beginning of the pandemic, people setting 5G towers on fire? You remember that? Because they thought it was causing COVID? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of biologists here who I'm sure were as confused as I was about that, particularly because I used to work on 5G and I was like, what? So that, by the way, you see this fire here? That's not even a 5G tower, that's a 3G tower. They weren't even very good at burning down the right towers, right? We remember, oh God, this guy again. But we remember this, he took hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin became a big thing, I'm sure here as well. It still is in certain quarters. So we have so many examples of misinformation and disinformation from the pandemic. But it's really important that we realize that this was a problem long before the pandemic. The pandemic just made it clear to people that there was a scientific misinformation problem. So back in 2018, there was some of you have probably seen this paper, it's in Science, it's a fantastic paper about lies spreading faster than truth. And they took thousands of stories on Twitter, even before Elon Musk got his dirty little fingers into it. And they found that no matter what the subject, whether it was politics or medicine or science, that stories that were not true or that were incorrect in some ways spread much, much further and much, much faster than things that were true. And we started having examples of this in public health very early on. So in the year 2000, in the USA, measles was declared eradicated. It was declared cured. Everyone got vaccinated, no measles. By 2015, they were having huge outbreaks. And the same picture was seen in Europe. In the year 2016, we had 4,000 cases of measles in Europe. In 2018, we had 87,512, right? So these are big numbers. And that's because, as you know, measles is highly contagious. It has an R0 of 12 to 18. So you need a lot of people to get vaccinated. And if a few people don't, you get into a dangerous situation where people can get sick. So we knew these problems existed before the pandemic. And this was such a big thing that in 2019, the WHO were forced to declare vaccine hesitancy a top 10 threat to public health. So they put it in the top 10 things that they were worried about. And this is before we knew about COVID or even were having discussions about COVID vaccines. So this was a problem. We sometimes think of this as a pandemic era problem, but it's important we realize the seeds of this were sown long before, and they've been a problem for a very, very long time. And today I'm going to try and unpack a little bit why that was the case. This is a paper I had very early on in the pandemic, and it was just a snapshot of what the public think. A lot of this is US data, but it maps to Europe pretty well. So it's a pretty good thing it might map to Mexico pretty well as well. So about 12% of people believe that water fluoridation is a conspiracy. We might come back to it later, Robert Kennedy Jr. That GMOs are a plot to control the world population, things like that. COVID-19 being caused by 5G, that's about 15% of the American population believed that at the time. And what I think is shocking, how many people here work with cancer, either directly or indirectly? A few of you? Yeah, a few of you. 37% of Americans believe that the FDA was suppressing a cure for cancer. That's about 110, 120 million people. That's, I tell you, that's staggering, you know. There's a lot of reasons that's shocking. And again, about 20% thinking cell phones cause cancer, and that 20% thinks vaccines cause autism. So we've always had a problem. This is just exacerbated by the pandemic. Some definitions we'll talk about because it's very easy to get mixed up. We hear people say misinformation, disinformation. Sometimes they go in the Russian, they say dezinformacja, but it goes all crazy. So we're going to use the Council of Europe definitions. Misinformation is very much an umbrella term. It covers a lot of things, but specifically what it means is inadvertent propagation of false or misleading claims. And we'll talk a bit about that. So this is not put out there with an intention to mislead. It is wrong, but it's not usually done intentionally. Disinformation, by contrast, is false information that is deliberately put out there to mislead. And we're going to see some really nasty examples of that in this talk as well. And there's the other one. Has anyone ever heard of its cousin, malinformation? Oh, you see, this is the one I love, and I think this is the most evil of all of them because it's usually the case what we see on social media. It's factually correct information, but out of context to give you a misleading impression. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. It's the strangest one, but it's the most powerful one. And these are the definitions we're going to use. And I look at this as a Cerberus problem, the three-headed dog, right, that we have to be fighting all the time, and we have to understand where they come from and why. So let's start with medical misinformation, the most innocent of this trinity of evil sisters, right? It is by definition that which is false, but is accidentally spread. And it's usually benign in origin. People spread it by accident because they didn't realize it was false and it wasn't intentionally there to cause harm. Let's unpick some examples. So there's an institute of, I'll skip over a second. How many people have heard the claim that sugar makes children hyperactive? Yeah? It's totally false. It's totally, absolutely false, right? Yet it is so ingrained that I even say it to my niece. I go, oh, she's had too much sugar. And then I have to remind myself that was based on a single case study from 1972 that was debunked in 1973. And every time what you can do, which I think is amazing, you can give children placebo sugar and then tell their parents they've had real sugar, and their parents will report that they are more hyperactive. So it's a great example of observer bias effect. It turns out if you have children and you've been around children, if you put lots of children together, they're very hyper. It's not the sugar, it's the fact they're young, and it's fantastic, right? So a lot of you work in neurobiology, right? There's the institute right across the way with the giant ring just there, right? How many of you have heard this one? We only use 10% of our brains. You know what, maybe Trump voters use 10% of their brains, but the rest of us use the whole thing, at different times, different parts, and we have fMRI and all that fancy stuff that proves it. This, again, is a myth that actually started in the 1940s. Now, when people say these things, they're not trying to mislead. They genuinely have heard them, and they become accepted as fact, even though they're not. So this is what we call misinformation. Not true, but no one's intending to harm with it. That doesn't mean it can't cause harm. And I'm going to give you an example of this. Does anyone know who this guy is? Yeah, I heard someone say that. Linus Pauling. Linus Pauling is the only person to have ever won 2 Nobel Prizes on his own. One for peace and I think one for chemistry. Sometimes called the father of molecular biology. In 1966, he got obsessed with living forever. He wanted to live forever. And he got very open-minded about who he talked to. And some guy called Irving Stone came up to him and said, if you take mega doses of vitamin C, you'll live forever. Now, you'd think a scientist might go, really? Not Linus Pauling. No. Linus Pauling took a huge dose of vitamin C and said, I feel younger. I feel fantastic. I'm going to write a book about this. And he did. He wrote this book in 1977, Vitamin C and the Common Cold, where he claimed vitamin C would cure the common cold, right? Now, vitamin C does not cure the common cold. We've done a lot of subsequent research. Linus Pauling also wrote books claiming that it would cure snake bite, cancer, and AIDS. Vitamin C doesn't do any of that. What it does do if you take mega doses is give you diarrhea. So it's possible the increased feelings of, activity he felt were in his bowels, maybe, we don't know. But the point is, when you hear people now selling vitamins, and vitamins are a huge market, you have to realize that there's very little evidence for it, and it's based on anecdotes. This is a classic bit of misinformation, and we'll come back to this later on, that a Nobel Prize-winning scientist was deliberately involved in setting it. And it doesn't abate. If you look at vitamin sales across, this is just vitamin C, this is in billions. Now, it's huge. The market increases every year, and it's projected to increase up and up and up. And that's because that myth that was set in 1977 by one guy getting it horribly wrong has become a very lucrative market, and also shows you, I don't think Linus Pauling intended to mislead. I think he was just a bit stupid. For a very smart man, he had a very big gap in his knowledge and decided with the arrogance of a white man that he would just jump in there and knew everything about everything. And I speak as a white man, we're very arrogant, right? But the problem is this can be harmful, really harmful. So from cancer research, I'll give you an example where a bit of misinformation really harms people, even if it's not supposed to harm people. So we know, for example, if a thing called the Warburg effect exists in tumors. And this is the observation that tumors use more glucose than the more efficient oxygen metabolism, and they produce more lactate, acid, and things like that. So back in 1924, Otto Warburg suggested that maybe the switch to that glucose pathway was a cause of cancer. We've since found that it is not. It's a consequence of the mutations that occur in cancer. But because of this belief, you've probably heard these different ideas. The alkaline diet can cure cancer. An all-meat diet, a ketogenic diet will cure cancer. Or alternatively, a totally vegan diet will cure cancer. They're all wrong, and they all stem from a misunderstanding of this effect. Each one of these very different diets, we have to admit that someone saying, only eat meat and you'll cure cancer is very different than someone saying, only eat vegetables and you'll cure cancer. And yet they stem from the same epistemic mistake. So I kind of put it in a little graph here. It's kind of hard to see. But the fact that they increase glucose consumption, that makes people think, okay, cancer cells want to eat more glucose, so you have to starve them. You can't give them sugar or you can't give them carbs. That's nonsense. Your body will take whatever it is. If you give it a carrot or a carrot cake, it doesn't care. It's going to turn it into glucose, and even your healthy cells need that. So that's the other thing. Because there's a lot of lactate that's produced in the tumor microenvironment from that switch to that pathway, the tumor microenvironment is more acidic, and then some people think, oh great, we can have an alkaline diet. You can only eat like alkaline foods. That'll cure your cancer. Except that you can't alter your bodily pH, because then otherwise you every time you ate a very spicy taco, you would die, which is good. We don't, which is great. You might feel like you're dying if it's too hot, but too picante, and then you're in trouble. But you can't change your bodily tissue, pH. Your body regulates that for very good reason. You don't want to do that. So that's a misconception that stems from that as well. And the fact that there is, that lactate production, that's the idea that, okay, we can just eat keto or eat meat and we'll never get glucose, so therefore it won't matter. This is all false. But this is hugely damaging to cancer patients. I do a lot of work with cancer patients around the world, and almost all of them, if you ask them, will have been told by some friend or family member they need to give up sugar, they need to give up carbs. And that can make them very sick. They can lose a lot of weight, and they can die, and I've seen it happen. And if you go onto Amazon, we did a paper on this last year in The Lancet Oncology, myself and Liz O'Riordan over in the UK, and we went and just looked at how many TikTok videos about this were going around. The idea that sugar feeds cancer had millions of views, but the keto diet in cancer, 2.7 billion views. If you go onto Amazon, the top-selling books on cancer are all about this diet. That kills patients. No one is trying to kill patients. Doesn't matter, it's still going to kill them. So misinformation, even without intent to cause harm, is really dangerous. Now let's go for something that's even more dangerous. Let's go more negative. I want to depress you a bit more this morning, right? You might wonder why I have a picture of Stalin up here. This is relevant. Medical disinformation, by contrast, is far more sinister because it's designed to mislead you. It's designed to make you scared, angry, or to sway you towards a certain behavior by putting out a falsehood. It has a really interesting history and motivation. Disinformation began in the modern sense in the Soviet Union in 1923, when under Stalin, he was a really big fan of it, and he decided you can damage your enemies by spreading myths. We'll see a really good example of this in a few minutes. They actually, the name was desinformatia, and it was supposed to sound French, even though to me it sounds quite Russian. And the idea that even back then, the Soviets were trying to make it look like it was Western. So they were trying to blame the French for it. They set up their first office of disinformation in 1923. So disinformation in its modern sense is 102 years old. Happy birthday, disinformation. But we'll talk a bit about why. I'll show you how damaging this can be. So during the 1960s onwards, in the Cold War period, the Soviets got really good at disinformation. And whatever came up in the newspapers, they would try to engender this feeling of distrust. So a lot of disinformation isn't designed to convince you, it's designed to make you distrustful. So in the late 70s, early 80s, AIDS came to the USA. And at the time, they didn't know what AIDS was. It was just a strange cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, that was affecting young gay men, it was usually seen in elderly Jewish men. So it was a bit of a strange thing. They didn't know what to call it, so they called it gay-related immunodeficiency, GRID. Then they later found on that it didn't just affect gay people, it affected everyone who got, HIV. So what the Soviets did was they created a fake story. And the fake story they created was that AIDS was made in a US lab and was designed to kill black people, poor people, and immigrants, right? And because the Reagan administration at the time was awful to black people, poor people, and immigrants, this found a division in society, a real division that existed in American society, and made people angry and distrustful. So the Soviets poured it in there, and they called this Operation Infection, very well named, to create this hatred. This, by the way, I have a copy of this at home, the original fake bit of propaganda. It came out of East Germany in 1984, and it's a brilliant case study in disinformation. There's only one problem for the Soviets in this story. AIDS was very real, and in 1987, AIDS came to Russia. Now, under Tony Fauci, Tony Fauci had got the CDC, despite the Reagan administration not really wanting to put any money into AIDS research. They had got the first antiretroviral treatments, and that was largely driven by the CDC with a lot of help from Tony Fauci. So the Soviets then had to ask the Americans for help. And the condition that the Americans helped them on was they stopped with the goddamn rumor, right? They dropped it. And they did. They apologized for it in 1991 after the fall of communism. But the problem was the myth has gone on. You can't stop a bit of disinformation once it starts. So under the government of Thabo Mbeki in South Africa in the late 1990s, they embraced this conspiracy theory of AIDS denialism. And they used fringe experts like Peter Duesberg to come and support it, and we'll talk about him later if we have time. And they told people that ARTs, antiretroviral therapies, were poisons. So they said, use beetroot, use natural remedies, all this kind of stuff. They were heavily influenced by the Soviet disinformation campaign, even though the Soviets had abandoned it. The Soviet era had ended. Unfortunately, that led to about 345,000 preventable deaths under Thabo Mbeki's regime. So by some estimates, even today, half of African Americans are distrustful of the idea that AIDS is naturally occurring. They still believe it might be man-made. Does that give anyone déjà vu to something else that's been happening recently? Lab leak conspiracy theories, the idea that COVID was made in a lab. It was interesting to me to see that because I wrote in the book a lot about the history of AIDS denialism and the conspiracy theories. It was interesting to see that Russia and China spent a lot of their time and money promoting this conspiracy theory, right? And the Americans have swallowed it wholeheartedly on certain sides. So again, this is designed to fracture, to cause harm. Disinformation, designed to cause harm by finding real gaps in our knowledge and society and exploiting them. So it's very intentional. The other type of that was nakedly political, but it's not always political. It can be about our health and not political. But I want you to guess a year, right? There's riots over vaccine mandates in public places, that the media is full of angry rhetoric about vaccines and drives, and there are Supreme Court cases about vaccines. Anyone want to guess what year this was? Last year? Anyone else? Any other years? Yeah. I would say 1856, 1905, 1901, 1874 in Liverpool, 1806 actually was one of the earliest cases. In fact, in 1905, the US Supreme Court had to rule on the idea of vaccine mandates, and they ruled they were actually constitutional. That was back in 1905, the Johnson judgment. This one here, I collect anti-vaccine propaganda, old stuff, because it's really old. I collect it to show my students. That's one from, I don't know, this is the Anti-Smallpox League. I think that's 1856. I think this one is 1870. And I have other ones going back even earlier. So this kind of propaganda about vaccines is even older than you think. It really hasn't changed much, by the way. So I want to show you some of my other collection of anti-vaccine propaganda. That one I think is 1901. This one I think is 1804. So some of them have the year on them. I should really write them down. I'm trying to see if I can. But you see the tropes are the same, that, vaccination, it's all about money. It's all about the government wanting to control you. So why has this existed so long? Because this is ideological disinformation. One of the reasons that people are, there's a lot, and we'll talk about it towards the end, why are people very anti-vaccine, for example? And I should also point out that anti-vaccine isn't a binary. It's not usually pro or anti. It's usually a spectrum, a continuum. But we'll call the people who are very, very keen on this, we'll call them anti-vaxxers just for the sake of argument because it's easier. And the ones making this propaganda truly believe it. But usually when you look at them and psychologists talk to them, they have a very strange view of the world. They see the world as easily divisible into natural and unnatural, right? So they say synthetic, man-made, that's bad, natural is good. Now, uranium and arsenic and Ebola are all natural, but I wouldn't put them on my breakfast cereal, okay? So they have a bit of a problem with this definition. And they tend to be very much of a view that the world, because this is man-made, this is bad. They don't really understand the immunology behind it or the science or the reasoning. They just feel it's bad. So therefore, they are happy to lie about it to get more people on their cause. This is an example of ideological motivation. They're not necessarily making money from it. A lot of them are. We will see recently that a lot of them make a lot of money out of it. Disinformation is very profitable. But if you ever wonder why people engage in these health conspiracy theories, it's sometimes because their worldview allows them to support this. So therefore, they would be happy to believe that you as scientists don't care about them because you're doing the man-made evil stuff and they're all for the natural stuff. Which is, if any of you have ever got hate mail from the public, which I get a lot of, it's mainly my personality, but sometimes my work, you'll find that this is where a lot of it comes from. They literally will see you as the enemy because you work for the side of the man-made, so you must be against the natural, so therefore you're an easy target. So, finally, I want to give us a brief exercise together as a group. Some of you will have heard this. If you have, keep the secret. You might have heard of hydric acid, DHMO. And this is, by the way, very, very abundant. It's found in nuclear waste, acid rain, human tumors, everywhere. You can use it as a fire retardant. Sometimes it's contaminated with PFAS as well. Prolonged exposure causes death, tissue damage. And about, over 250,000 deaths a year are caused by exposure to DHMO. It's so corrosive that it can destroy metal, it can rust things, it can accelerate processes, act as a catalyst. And there was a debate about this in Finland in 1994. Do you think that that's something we maybe should ban from, our food supply? Who here would ban this chemical DHMO? See, you're all too smart for this. This is the wrong audience. Yeah, because all of you recognize this. But Finland actually did initially vote to ban it until it was revealed it was a prank by high school students. Because as you've noticed, DHMO is dihydrogen monoxide, H2O. It's water. Everything I have told you about water in that list is true. It kills loads of people. If you heat it up, it burns you. But we kind of need it. And this is a great example of the last part of our trilogy, malinformation. I have told you stuff that's all true about water and all the bad stuff. I've left out the fact that you'll die pretty quickly without it. I could tell you about oxygen. I worked a lot with oxygen in cancer for a long time. Oxygen is carcinogenic. It's explosive. It's highly corrosive. But you try living without it for a while and tell me how you get on, right? So it turns out that we can take information out of context to create a misleading impression. It's very insidious. It's kind of evil. It's kind of genius. And that's the third part of a trilogy we see. And I feel the most evil one. We all talk about misinformation and disinformation. And they're relatively easy to show, well, that's false. The information is false, right? With malinformation, it's a bit harder because the information is true. It's just out of context. For example, you get in your car and you put on your seatbelt, right? Your seatbelt you put on because it's most likely to save your life. But some people throughout history have got decapitated by their seatbelt, right? So if I was going against seatbelts, I would just emphasize people are decapitated every year by their seatbelts. I just hide the information where it saves way more lives. You see that with anti-vaccine propaganda too. They're very concerned about, allergic reactions and things like that, while ignoring the thousands and sometimes millions of lives saved. That's interesting. So again, unlike it, the information is actually true, but it's out of context and it's designed to inflict harm and it's designed to mislead. And the intention really matters, by the way. Sometimes misinformation and malinformation can be very similar. But if you're trying to mislead, it's malinformation. If you just don't really know the area well enough, it's misinformation. And it's far more subtle, I think, and more odious than other things. I'll give you an example. How many people here have heard that cannabis cures cancer? Well, it doesn't, spoiler alert. But it's really important where this comes from. I was working on a campaign back in Ireland in 2016, and I started getting a lot of hate mail from these kind of people, because I wrote a piece saying, look, we were talking about legalizing cannabis in Ireland, and I was like, well, look, if you want to legalize it for your own recreational use, yeah, but stop telling people it cures cancer. And I got very angry emails, and this is all false, by the way. I should have put a spoiler alert. This is not true. But this is the kind of stuff you find online if you look this up. And the bit of evidence they would give me to prove this, they would say, aha, look, if you put cancer cells in a Petri dish and you treat them with THC, the psychoactive component in cannabis, the cancer cells die. And they are right, they do. But they also die if you put water in them, or bleach, or salt, or leave in the incubator slightly at the wrong temperature, or anyone here work with cells? It's really easy to kill cells. What it's really hard to do is to kill cells inside the human body while sparing healthy cells. And that's what an effective anti-cancer agent has to do. Cannabis has been tested for that. It's useless, right? It's good at getting you high, but it's very poor at most other things. It's even not particularly good at pain management, but that's another story. It's a third-line cure for that reason, or third-line treatment. But yet, because they had that bit of misinformation or malinformation, they would use that. And I saw firsthand patients give up their treatment and start taking cannabis oil or cannabis and then dying. Steve Jobs is a classic example. Steve Jobs from Apple, when he was diagnosed with cancer, he had a very rare form of pancreatic cancer that was survivable with treatment. Instead of getting treatment, he, allegedly one of the richest men in the world with the best resources, he went online and started having a juicing diet and Gerson therapy and refused poisons, which he called them, like chemotherapy. Spoiler alert, it has to be a bit poisonous to kill cancer cells. I mean, that's the idea, right? And by the time he realized that he was getting much sicker, his cancer was not curable anymore, and he died. We know his story because he's famous and rich and really daft. But here's the thing, that tragedy plays out on a personal level in every country, every day. I see it all the time. I talk to patients, families, and they said, look, we lost our cousin, we lost our brother, we lost our sister to this. And there's no consequences for the people who spread this malinformation, but there are consequences if you fall victim to it. And the public are very, very prone to falling victim to it. And this is, again, there's a comic from XKCD that always sums it up for me. If you see something can kill cancer cells in a Petri dish, so can a handgun. We're not going to shoot patients to make them better. There's an old joke. I used to work with radiotherapists who said, we can cure every cancer at radiation. It's just that we sometimes kill the patient. And again, we're generally trying not to kill the patient. It's generally the purpose of treatment. And one of the reasons this worries me is when people get exposed to these claims of complementary alternative cures, they are more likely, like Steve Jobs, to delay their treatment or reject it. And that translates into a pretty bad picture. You're all familiar with Kaplan-Meier survival curves. You've seen these before. This is from a Lancet oncology paper by a colleague of mine, Skylar Johnson, from 2018. Patients who took no complementary medicine had a much lower hazard ratio of death per unit time than those taking complementary medicine. And when you correct for their cancer staging and type. And the reason for that was a lot of the ones who went down the alternative route delayed their treatment. And delaying your treatment is usually a bad idea. They ignored their oncologists, and a lot of them rejected their treatment. And that's when you get those horrible differences in a curve. And every one of those differences is a statistic to us, but is a tragedy to the families. So why do people do it? You know, we've kind of talked about it a bit. Sometimes it's political. You want to go out there and, you know, I mean, I don't want to mention the orange goblin up north too much, but there is a political thing. If you spread disinformation about health, you get a lot of traction. Like the Russians, you can use it as a political football. Sometimes it's ideological, like the anti-vaccine movement. They truly believe natural good, unnatural bad, and that's it. Sometimes it's financial. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., likely to be the new, head of health sciences in the US, made literally millions in recent years out of spreading anti-vaccine propaganda. So it's lucrative, right? There's an audience for it. And a massive factor, which I won't get into too much, I do another version of this talk where I talk about the psychology a lot more, but we'll talk about people more likely to spread anti-vaccine and anti-health conspiracy theories tend to be very egotistical. They have marked traits of narcissism. And because it makes them feel powerful and special and informed. Although there's a brilliant experiment that was done on people that spread the idea that autism is caused by vaccines. Scientists independently assessed them for their knowledge of both vaccination and autism, and then asked them to rate their knowledge. And then they asked immunologists and they asked the general public who weren't anti-vaccine activists. Guess who scored the lowest in knowledge of both vaccines and of autism? The people spreading this link. It's a real version of a Dunning-Kruger effect. Their ignorance was no impediment to their confidence. And that's very scary. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, famously said that the tragedy of this world is that the stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt. And sometimes that's what we're seeing here with the ego stuff. I also think it's really important to make a distinction between people that spread this misinformation, the egotistical people that enjoy the attention and the money and everything else, and the people that fall victim to it. So there is a distinction, and I do see there's a big difference between that as well. By the way, and this is shocking, we know that people will spread these falsehoods even when they know they're false. We can't just say it's ignorance. Believing a story was false is no barrier to sharing it if you're trying to signal to other people in your tribe that you're part of it, you're part of their tribe. I don't think that half the conspiracy theorists I deal with really believe the conspiracy theories. They just want to signal to other people. Do the Americans who say the election was stolen really believe it, or do they just want other Trump supporters to like them? Psychology is complicated, probably both, right? But what if it's not consistent? A lot of health conspiracy theories aren't consistent. Famously during COVID, when it was at its worst, you would hear from the same people that COVID was a hoax, but it could be cured by ivermectin, but it was being covered up by the government. These are all inconsistent, and that never stopped them. It's really important to realize that disinformation doesn't have to be consistent. In fact, it works sometimes better when it's not. And that, as you're all scientists, probably is very confusing. You would go, hang on, your theory is not consistent. It doesn't have to be, because it's meant to catch you in the feelings. As my students say, the vibes are against the government, so therefore it's okay. It's also not always designed to convince you. It's sometimes designed to confuse you. And this is what's sometimes called the RAND model corporation of the fire hose of falsehood. And the idea, it's a Russian propaganda technique that's been adopted by a lot of terrible people. It has to be high volume, so constantly out there across many channels. You want it on TikTok, you want it on Instagram, you want it on blogs, you want it everywhere, on X, whatever that is now. It has to be shameless. It doesn't care about lies. It doesn't care if they're easily caught out. Who is this sounding like, by the way? It doesn't care if it's, if you catch it in a lie. It just keeps doing it. No commitment to truth, doesn't need to be consistent. It's rapid and repetitive. The point is not to persuade you, but to overwhelm you, to make you apathetic. Very good at that. And it assumes a low trust environment and lowers it further, right? So it goes, the standard is bad, we'll make it worse. The number of arguments matters more than the quality, and it's the sheer volume that's overwhelming. And there's psychological reasons that works. We have things like the availability heuristic, where we will weigh information as more important if we hear it a lot, if it's easy to recall, and the illusory truth effect, which is the idea that the constant repetition of a falsehood makes us primed to accept it, even if we know it's false. For me, that's the kids being hyperactive in sugar. I know it is false, but I've heard it so often that it feels true. Turns out that we are very easy to manipulate, and this is why maybe a TikTok bang wasn't the worst thing in the world. And again, the classic architect of this is, does anyone know who this man is? He's awful. Yeah, it's Steve Bannon. And Steve Bannon had his own version of it during the first Trump election, where he said, we need to flood the zone with shit. And it's flooding the zone until there's all noise and you don't know what to believe, so you're more likely to believe something that's false. And we've seen this, by the way, in politics hugely. These are cute graphs. These are from American politics, right? This is 1994, when Republicans and Democrats were very close together. And even in 2014, they're still pretty close. So you might get a Republican one year, a Democrat the next year. By 2014, they're starting to diverge. Now, I should have put the picture up for 2020. They're two separate islands. They exist in different postcode. If you were a statistician, you'd say the effect size is very, very large, right? We no longer inhabit the same political world. And part of the reason for that is that we've become polarized. One of the problems with disinformation, health disinformation as well, but disinformation in general, is that it has worn down our ability to work out what's true and what's false. And we just find little echo chambers that support us. So this is from, I won't give you the full quote, but the Columbia Journalism Review warned in 2016 that as social media makes us curators of our own media, that we'll start cherry picking what's easiest for us to believe, what is most convenient. And this affects the public massively. If you want to believe that vaccines are dangerous, there's loads of websites that'll tell you that. There's loads of social media influencers that'll tell you that. You can follow them. We all have problems with traditional media, and we often roll our eyes, but at least they had some commitment to fact-checking, some journalistic integrity. We can't assume that anymore. And of course, sorry, I'm looking at the time. So what does that matter? How does that affect us? Well, It affects our public perception of trust. The precise harm the health misinformation here, as the umbrella term does, is still being quantified. We don't really know, but we know it's pretty bad from the limited studies we have done. We can look at a few case studies. Does anyone remember the parasite cleanse trend? If the younger members, oh good, I'm glad you missed it. This was a thing last year and the year before, and now it's coming back again, where people would take bleach as an enema to get rid of parasites. And then they would post the results on TikTok and go, oh look, there's loads of worms in my stool. Except it wasn't worms, it was part of their intestinal lining because they'd put bleach in their anus. 738 million people did that. Yeah, so this is why when people go banning TikTok, I'm like, I'm not against it. So this is the problem. We've seen during COVID, things like the disinformation dozen, that 12 people were responsible for 65% of the COVID misinformation in the year 2021 and 2022. One of them was Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who will probably be in charge of the NIH and the CDC and the FDA. We live in the stupidest timeline, okay? We do. If there's a multiverse theory, we have found the dumbest one and just really embraced it. There he is. God, I hate that man. I'm not even... So what makes people vulnerable to this? Why are some groups more vulnerable than others? And what makes anti-science messaging so powerful? Well, let's just talk about it. There's a great paper in Nature Reviews Psychology. Nature does love reviewing things. And this one kind of broke it into two broad factors, some of which I've alluded to. The first were cognitive drivers. This is stuff in your intellectual process. People who are more prone to intuitive thinking, had a lack of analytical thinking, were more, went on their vibes, so to speak, were far more likely to fall for it. Did anyone read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow? No? He talked about system 1 and system 2 thinking and the easy heuristic thinking that a lot of people do. Analytical thinking is expensive. It costs more glucose, costs more brain time. So a lot of people, what feels right, they'll believe. Cognitive failures, so things like not asking about the source, like did you get that from the New York Times or your racist uncle's Facebook page? If you forget to ask source costs, you'll weigh them both as equal. They're not, right? And then asking the question, and you as scientists do this all the time. If someone shows you a claim, you go, yeah, but what about is there evidence to the contrary? People who forget to do that are more likely to fall for misinformation and false beliefs. I mentioned illusory truth. This is that scary thing, that familiarity and fluency. If we see an idea repeated a lot, we start thinking it's true even if it's not. And cohesion, if it's in line with your worldview, it's easier to accept as true. The other things were socio-affective drivers. If this messaging is coming from people who you want to be in their gang, they're cool. If it's a Kardashian selling you an MRI scan and you want to be a bit like a Kardashian, why? I don't know, but people do. It's an elite in-group attractive message, which makes you more likely to accept it. It's absolutely true. And that goes into our emotions. Stuff that makes us emotional is more likely to affect us. We react before we reason. That is why most, say, anti-vaccine propaganda is designed to make you scared and angry. Oh God, they're killing children. That's terrifying. It's not true, but it's terrifying. And then a worldview. Well, your worldview, if you are already inclined to think that scientists are evil, well, you're more likely to embrace, misinformation about them. Health literacy is a big problem too. So I don't know what the statistics are here, but in Ireland, 23% of the population struggle with basic literacy. And health literacy is even lower. Some estimates put it only about half the population can properly work out, talk to their healthcare providers and get good medical advice. They'll go to their doctors and not really understand what's being said. They'll buy a packet of aspirin and not really understand the dose instruction. Low health literacy is linked with some really bad outcomes. Increased hospital stays, higher mortality rates, what you'd expect. But it's also linked with falling for health disinformation. People who are more vulnerable are more affected. And it's a really powerful acceptance. And these people are victims. Sometimes it's easy to laugh and go, haha. For example, the radio host in COVID, who didn't take a vaccine because he was scared and then died of COVID. That happened a lot. But that's the consequences. That was a very sad story about a man who lost his wife and then became an advocate for the COVID vaccine. So it's easy for people to go, oh, he should have taken it. But actually, he had very low health literacy. He believed this stuff because social media told him, and people he thought he trusted taught him this. So, you got to be careful with this stuff. It's not all bad news. It's not all bad news. I got some good news too, right? You're all scientists. Some of you are medical doctors. Congratulations, you are the most trusted people in the world, right? Any medical doctors here? Yeah, any medical? Good. No, sorry. I know I love my medical colleagues. I work in a school of medicine. I love my medical colleagues, but it always annoys me that they're slightly more trusted, slightly more, because they're not as good at evidence appraisal. And I have to often correct them and go, no, you did that wrong, as you all have. Scientists were right up there. We're very trusted, which means what we say carries a certain weight, which means when we are talking to the public, that we can do really good things if we have the time and the ability to communicate things. And I'd often say, and I'll talk at the end about this, it's not debate. Everyone thinks debate is the way we do things. Discussion, so much more powerful. You're sitting there with a family member who's a bit afraid of, GMOs or vaccines, and you go, why do you think that? Where'd you get that information from? That's cool, let's discuss it. You've planted the seeds to help them change their mind. No one ever changes anyone else's mind. You give people the ability to change their own, and they'll do it themselves. No one's ever changed your mind, So if you go and debate and go, no, you've already put people into a corner. And social media thinks that debate is fantastic. Debate is the worst. And I speak as someone who was once a champion debater. I know it rewards people that are able to lie about things and twist facts. That's exactly what it does. It's harder for discussion to do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about statistics. I'm going to take a little bit of a sidestep for a second, because I then want to talk about what scientists can do better to finish up this. Because I've told you that you're basically heroes, and now I'm going to tell you, okay, we don't do everything right, and here's some things that we need to think about. And I did put statistics in this title, and I am a chartered statistician, so sorry if you have a fear of statistics. I'm going to tell you, you should have. No, I'm not. Does anyone know who this man or this woman is? I wouldn't expect so. But this is a horrific case. Back in the late 1990s, this woman is called Sally Clark. She was a lawyer, solicitor, and living in the UK. And within a year, she had two personal tragedies. One of her sons died aged 11 months from sudden infant death syndrome. Then 7 months later, her other son died from sudden infant death syndrome. Tragedy, awful. Except for some reason, the UK police decided this might be murder, because the UK police love looking for murders. So they went to this guy, Professor Sir Roy Meadows. Professor Sir Roy Meadows was one of the most famous pediatricians in the world. There's another reason I'm glad my medical colleagues aren't here, because they hate this story, right? He came in and he said, oh, this is definitely a murder. And the way he did this was, he said the odds of having a sudden infant death in a family like Sally Clark's that was rich, non-smokers, was 1 in 8,400. The odds of having two, he then said, must be like coin flips. It's 1 in 8,400 times 1 in 8,400, and he said it's 1 in 73 million. So he told the jury that there was only 1 in 73 million chance that Sally Clark was innocent. So Sally Clark went to jail. It's just a little problem with that. There's actually 5 little problems with that. Sally Clark was innocent. She didn't do anything, right? She just had been very unfortunate. It turns out it was wrong for 2 reasons. Firstly, SIDS runs in families. You can't suddenly assume like it's a coin flip, that they're totally independent events. So firstly, his entire reasoning was bonkers, right? The second thing is that it was wrong anyway. Even if his figures had been correct, and 1 in 73 million on the odds of a mother killing her 2 children was he needed to compare that with the likelihood that a mother would murder her 2 children. He computed the odds in his wrong odds, but he computed it of 2 sudden infant death syndromes. You'd have to compare that in Bayes' theorem with the likelihood of a mother killing her 2 children. And when you do the maths, it's an awful lot lower. So it's far more likely that there was 2 infant deaths. The Royal Statistical Society in the UK got really annoyed about this, and I'm a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, and they only very occasionally get annoyed. They're very nice, but they got annoyed enough that this eventually was retried. Sally Clark got a second hearing and was acquitted. But by that stage, she'd been in prison for years. She'd lost her 2 children. She had taken to alcohol, and within a few years of getting out, she died from alcohol-related diseases. But 5 other cases this man testified in put innocent women in prison too, some of whom died in prison, right? It's a really good message to get our statistics right, because they matter. By the way, there's a case going on in the UK at the moment, and I'm not sure, it's getting some coverage in the US media, I don't know here. There's a nurse who's been accused, or has been convicted of killing 7 children. The Royal Statistical Society are very, very worried about it because there's no evidence that she did kill the children. They're using very bad statistics on the prosecution side. And there's a reason why we have to get our stats right, but it's really easily misled by them. Does anyone know what this guy is? I think it's supposed to be HIV, but I did use ChatGPT, so God knows what it gave me. Again, you can tell I'm not a virologist, right? But the Western Blot ELISA test for HIV is super accurate, right? It's 99.99% specific and 100% sensitive. So it's 99.99% accurate. Really good test. Now, I'm looking around this room here. You all look pretty low risk. None of you look like IV drug users. You a little bit. But you know, so you're all pretty low risk background. Now, let's say you go in and you get a test and it comes back and it says, I'm sorry, you have HIV. What is the probability that you have HIV? Anyone want to? You don't have to give me the exact figure. Just, do you think it's high because the test is very, 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 very accurate? We say high? Or we say very low? I like you're all trying to hedge. You're all like, I don't know, but I'm gonna guess. Does anyone have any strong? Who says high? Hands up for high. Okay, 1, 2, 3. And hands up for low? Hands up for like exactly even, 50%. Congratulations, those of you who said 50%. That's the odds. I hid some information from you. I hid some very important information. I didn't tell you how common it was for people like you to have HIV. About 1 in 10,000 low-risk people will have HIV. Let's imagine those 10,000 people all decide to go to the doctor on the same day. One of them has HIV. The test is super good. Boom. We got it, right? That's a positive test. But in the remaining 9,999 who don't have HIV, the test is good, but it's not perfect. You're going to get 1 false positive. So now if you look at your entire cohort, you have 2 positive results, only 1 of which is a true positive. 1 in 2. 50%. This is Bayes' theorem. Statistics are confusing, right? We think, by the way, this used to be a problem because back in the early days of HIV, doctors would often administer this test. And I love my medical colleagues. Please don't think I'm mocking them entirely, but they're very confident about everything. And they would go, I'm sorry, you have AIDS, you're going to die. And then these people sold their property and went to live the remaining life and then found themselves alive 10 years later going, huh. And the doctor said, yeah, we made a bit of a mistake. We didn't realize the test wasn't perfect. Tests aren't perfect. We have to know about prevalence background. So the question we ask is, okay, the test might be perfect. How common is the condition? I won't go into a lecture at Bayes' theorem, although I'd love to. But it's very important to think about these things. But the question flips around a little bit. If you were high risk, if all of you were IV drug users, which are the highest risk population, we'd expect about 1.5% of you to have HIV, right? So if you have 110,000 people like that going in who are all high risk, 150 have HIV, we'll catch them, and in the remaining 9,850, we'll only get 1 false positive. Now, if you get a positive test, your odds on having HIV are 150 over 151, 99.34%. This is why prevalence matters. Do you remember during the rapid antigen test for COVID? People were debating, in Europe, this is a big debate. Were they accurate, were they not? It actually depends on how prevalent the condition is. I do a lot of work in screening. But because scientists sometimes forget to communicate their uncertainties and the complicating factors, we can sometimes make things a bit worse. It happens when and I've certainly done it. Getting into stats, I'm going to talk about this guy. Some of you probably heard about John Ioannidis. I've worked with John a bit. Controversial character, I know. But this paper he wrote back in 2005, I recommend everyone read it because it's very good at giving us humility as scientists. It's why most published research findings are false, right? Now, it's a bit explosive as a headline, but there is an argument he makes that they are not as accurate as they claim to be. And there's a few reasons for that, and a lot of them are in our statistics, because we all have a tendency to go p-hacking, right? Not intentionally, but we frame our questions in such a way that what we should do is we're going to test this question independently. But we're so looking for positive results because journals want positive results, because funders want them, that maybe if we squint a bit at a result, we can make it look different. And often, a lot of my research is looking at how different could we make a result look if we, we're misleading ourselves. So again, by the way, I love Student's t-test. You all know Student's t-test, right? You've all heard of it. Do you know who Student was? He's Irish. I love this. So Student's t-test was invented in the Guinness factory. That's why I have a big Guinness there. They hired a Cambridge statistician called William Seeley-Gossett, and they said, we need to work out if our batches of Guinness are high quality, and we have to have a test, and we only want you to use small numbers in each test. So he invented a test for that, but he wasn't allowed to publish it under his own name. And in the Guinness factory, has anyone ever been to Dublin to the Guinness factory? Hey, there you go. You'll realize they gave everyone who worked there, it's a very Dublin thing, I'm a Dub. It's a very Dublin thing to give people nicknames, right? Whether they want them or not, you're going to give them a nickname. And if you worked in the Guinness factory in the early 1900s, you got a nickname. And because William Seeley-Gossett is the nerdiest looking man who's ever existed, they called him Student. How are you, Student? What's the story with your lad? Yeah, that's a Dublin accent. Yeah, you can have it a little bit. So his nickname was Student. So he decided to publish all his papers under Student, which is why you have Student's t-test and Student's f-test. But it was invented for Guinness. But it's really easy to manipulate it. So this is something I worked out with James Hedges a while ago. It's really easy to abuse it by deciding you're going to selectively change your cutoff, or you're going to hide a bit of, for example, this is a classic one of a non-effective drug that is non-effective when you give it to plated cells, but if you just cut off one data point, yay, you've got a p-value less than 0.05, now we can go to Nature and get our paper. No. Science should be about accurately reporting what we do. It shouldn't matter, and I blame journals for this. I did a paper on this recently. I do blame journals for this, because they put you under pressure. They only want novel results. They should reward good science. And a lot of the times good science is, yeah, nothing, we did that thing, it didn't work. It's every bit as important to know a drug didn't work as to know a drug did work. But, Nature Cell Science only want the drug did work, even if the research that led there is shaky as hell. And this leads to a problem called research waste. Sorry, there's another example. It's really easy. We showed in the same paper, you can manipulate Kaplan-Meier curves the same way. You can do loads of stuff. Where did this go? So a guy I work with I have too many pointers. So about 87.5% of biomedical science is considered research waste. That's kind of a shocking figure, right? That means, by definition of research waste, that it is not replicable because it's not described well enough, or the methods are inappropriate, and the result inferred from it is wrong, or objectively not true. So this is a major problem, and you see it a lot in medical papers. So research waste is a scandal. It's huge. It's a huge thing. And this essay by Paul Glasgow is really I work with Paul a good bit. It's really worth a read, and they break down what they mean by it. That's what John's headline, most published research is false. It's not just to be inflammatory. It's the fact that if I get a paper, I should be able to replicate it myself entirely. But when we do replication experiments, they don't really work. Or there's data missing that we can't replicate it, and then we go back to the authors, and they don't reply to our emails. Anyone had that experience? Yeah, I had a colleague who worked with me in Oxford, and we just hired a new PI, a clinician scientist. He was a superstar, Nature, Cell, science papers. Really nice guy. He comes in. I won't mention his name, but he comes in, and he meant well. And my colleague, Pavitra, brilliant biologist, she's like, I'm going to do that experiment and because it's so cool. And she spends 6 months and a lot of mice trying to do this experiment. And if you've ever worked with mice, they're difficult. I just work with numbers. I mean, I don't work with mice. But she spent her weekends looking after the mice coming in. And eventually she went up to this unnamed person and said, I'm really struggling to get your result. And he said, hey, Pavitra, don't even worry about it. I did that experiment on 317 mice, and it only worked in 12 of them. So I published them. My favorite part of that story is Pavitra's husband is a statistician, and he had to go outside in the garden and scream. So we do that. We don't mean to. We're not trying to mislead. But he will get the Nature Cell Science papers for that, even though he's done bad science. Pavitra's done good science. She won't get that. So I blame journals, but I also kind of blame us too, because we've created that system. Questionable research practices, about 72% of papers have some questionable research practice. In cancer research, which is a field I worked in a lot, 89% of landmark experiments fail to replicate, which means only 11% do. And we are making life and death decisions on that. This is a more recent paper in eLife, a really good one, that they basically tried to replicate loads of preclinical experiments. and found out that they couldn't even get the data. They couldn't do it. It's shocking. And again, we have misconduct. We have fraud. About 3 in 100 scientists will commit fraud. Straight up malpractice, not just a mistake. Everyone commits mistakes. I've gone through my old papers and I find errors in there, dumb things. We all do that, that's fine. But about 3% of us will commit fraud in our career. About 1 in 25 papers has inappropriate image manipulation in it. As in, you got your Western ink blot and you change it a bit, or Elizabeth Bick and people like that are amazing at detecting it. They're like, they can see it, but I can't. So we have a real problem. How do we trust research? How do we tell the public to trust research if we don't trust research? How many of you have read a paper from someone's lab and went, I know that's nonsense? Yeah? Yeah, we do it all the time. But we shouldn't. We shouldn't have to. And we spend a fortune on this. About 56% of patients worldwide are in bad trials. They're in trials that aren't well designed enough to answer their research question. That's the research waste I was talking about earlier. You put patients through a drug regimen and you can't even design the experiment well enough to do it, to test if it'll work or not work. We spend about $8 billion a year on bad trials, That was just between April and May 2021. This is a big problem. And you probably remember the Alzheimer's controversy. You see this in Science sorry, I am ranting, I'm on my hobby horse, but I'll finish up soon, I promise. The problem that there was a Alzheimer's paper in 2006 about a betaloid or something like that, I can't pronounce these words, that was supposed to be very highly linked to Alzheimer's. Over $4 billion was spent researching that up until 2018, when they started to realize that the paper probably wasn't true, and it's since been retracted because it's a fraud. I wrote about that back in The Atlantic back in 2022. But it didn't just waste all that money, it wasted thousands of research hours, and it wasted our time from pursuing things that might have actually worked. Drugs and treatments that might have worked, because we all saw this crappy paper in Nature in 2006 that was wrong, it's false. I'll stop it, but it comes up a lot, and we see retracted papers all the time. And of course, this can cause real problems, and this goes back to public trust, which is where I want to get back to. Does anyone know who this man at the center of this is? This is Andrew Wakefield, absolutely. In 1998, Andrew Wakefield put a paper out where he claimed that autism was linked to the MMR vaccine. Spoiler alert, it was not. If you ever read the original paper, it's since been retracted. It was a case study of 12 people, 12 kids. Any statistician reading that would just cry. Right? It's bad. The way the experiment was set up badly. But he went out there. Now, it turns out he was taking money from 2 different legal firms, and he had his own patent on his own special vaccine. What he wanted to do was make money off this. He was eventually struck off the medical register, but he's a hero to the anti-vaccine movement, and he is the reason why 20% of people around the world believe that vaccines cause autism. They don't. And he's responsible for figures like this. And we've seen this, that the anti-vaccine movement have grown since Wakefield. Even now, this is a paper from 2021. This is 20 years after the paper is retracted. We're still suffering the consequences. So I'm going to finish up with one idea for scientists too, right? The public trust us, and that's a great thing. We're living in a post-fact age, but we're still trusted. But we have to remember my favorite physicist, because I once was a physicist, a long time ago. We have to remember this. The first principle of science is that we must not fool ourselves. And we are the easiest people to fool, right? If we stick to that principle, we do good science. And if we do good science, we help the public. And we make the world we live in better. When we go wrong, we contribute to the problem. So part of our problem is going to be communicating science well to the public, but also being humble enough to know that sometimes science isn't great, and sometimes we need to do better ourselves. So it's a really depressing talk. I hope you're all thoroughly depressed, and now Trump is president again. God, this is a terrible day. I'm sorry. If you want to hear more from me, I blare on things on social media an awful lot. I'm not sure, I think I got that address right. Daniela gave it to me earlier on. For some reason, if you ever want to read the book where I talk more about this, for some reason it's The Irrational Ape Around the World, but in North America, Good Thinking. I don't know why they renamed it. And I asked them about that, and they said that only 43% of Americans don't believe in evolution, so therefore don't believe we're apes. So that was always going to be a marketing failure in the US. And it's only gotten worse. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I'd love to talk with you a bit more, so I'll... Now I've burnt the ears off you for so long, I feel.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Dave. Thank you very much for coming, first of all, and thank you for this great talk. I think it's very, very symbolic that you are giving this talk this very day. And I have two questions. One is about about the misinformation part. So from what I could gather is that you would require a certain, I don't know, like support base or kind of a number of people who, I mean, you need to be known or be a political party or a politician with some powerful influence to have this effect, right? Because anyone can come up with disinformation and be ignored completely. So I don't know if that kind of phenomena is understood, like where is the threshold above which what you're spreading will permeate versus just be ignored. And then the second one is, I don't know, I wanted to get your thoughts on, it seems to me that with what's happening today, it's like truth, it's not even kind of important anymore. I feel like people, even knowing that something is false, it still adheres to it because it falls within a party line or ideology. And I really feel that's gonna be a real challenge for scientists and people with some, I don't know, power over knowledge, because it really feels to me, and other people have said this, that even when, I don't know, Trump or allies or whatever, can be completely, I don't know, cynical about spreading false things, knowing that people know that it's false, but it doesn't seem to matter anymore. I don't know what you think about it. To me, it's like the next level. Like, I am spreading this false thing, knowing it's false, and knowing that you know it's false, but we will kind of all be agreeing that this is. So I don't know, I wanted to get your thoughts on those two things.
So they're two very deep questions. So I'll try to make a stab at them, but they're excellent questions, and thank you for asking them. The first part is actually, how do we quantify misinformation effects and how to counter them, right? That's an excellent question, and we're missing the research. So what I do know, what I can tell you what's coming down the pipeline, because there's a very small community of people who do this kind of research, and I would be part of that, but I'm kind of on the periphery. We are coming up with mathematical models that do the spread of this. Sander van der Linden in Cambridge is one guy. I'm working with him on something, and we're trying to work out what the thresholds are. And the kind of depressing result that we're getting from the very basic models we have, and these will be published soon, I hope. They're under review at the moment, so hopefully we get them out there. But one of the very depressing things we're finding is that it's not that information has parity. It's not that if I go out there and say the false thing and you say the true thing, that they're equally weighed in the public mind. It's because usually the false thing is far more scary. And it turns out that the emotional, and this is where Sander's research is because he's a psychologist and I'm just a maths modeler, but it turns out that emotional weighing affects it. So ultimately, we're fighting a very difficult battle because we're scientists. We deal with statistics, we deal with data, we deal with things en masse. We can't tell one patient what will happen to them. We can say if we had hundreds of people who 10% would do whatever, but misinformation doesn't care. Long-term, the only solution to this is to inspire and teach critical thinking much earlier, right? So we will be more immune to it. And this is a concept of a thing called mental immunity. It's the idea that we can train our minds to have an immune system, that they can be far more critical. We can teach everyone to think like scientists, and we can do that because the scientific method is not the preserve just of scientists. It's a version of a Socratic method. It's a version of something that is all of humanity's purchase. We just teach it so badly, and we do kind of isolate it that only scientists, and I'm not sure what training you get over here, but I didn't encounter philosophy of science until I'd finished my PhD. You know, and that's shocking. We need to have those conversations earlier and to bring them into common parlance. So so the depressing answer to the first part is we're only starting to do the modeling, and you're right. It's not, the thresholds are really depressingly low. But the only way we can immunize, if we have people immunized against that earlier on, we'll do better. It's going to take us years to sort out the mess we're in now, but we can start training the future generation to be in less of a mess. And that's not just about science, it's about politics. Would we be where we are right now if people were better at understanding that social media is full of lies? Probably not. We would probably be in a better place. But we need to train that earlier on. Now, the second question you asked as well, can you just repeat the end part of it? I remember, it was a really good question, but now I've kind of gone off on a train.
No, right now it feels like truth is...
Yes. Yes, that the truth is tribal, right? And that's an excellent point. And it kind of follows on. Truth kind of is tribal, but only in certain circumstances. Truth is tribal on social media and echo chambers, right? In reality, I always say this, years ago, if I went to the pub in Skerries, my hometown in Dublin, and I came out with a mad idea that Princess Diana is actually secretly alive and she lives in Glasgow, right? My friends and everyone around me would say, no, you're an idiot, shut up, right? But now I go online and I type in Princess Diana's alive and lives in Glasgow. I will find a community of people that not only believe that, they believe it more than me. I become radicalized to only hang out with these people. And this is that polarization graph that we were saying, that people get further and further away from their concepts of truth. And then it becomes, it's too far back. It was somewhere, miles away. I had too many slides. Someone should have stopped me. But it's the idea of truth. But truth is only tribal in that medium. So what we need to do is bring back the idea that truth is an objective standard, or facts being an objective standard. At the moment, social media is a very new technology. We were not ready for it. And what social media companies do, and we see this with Mark Zuckerberg bowing the knee to Trump and everything else, they want to keep you on and they want to keep you engaged. The easiest way to keep you engaged, to make you angry and to give you the content you want, or they think you want. This is part of a critical thinking thing. We need to break that, because these people, these companies, these Elon Musks, these Zuckerbergs, they have far too much power over how democracies go these days as well. There's no short-term solution for that. You're right. If you go online, it's very tribal. But again, if you read newspapers, it's still not. Well, there's some exceptions. So I think that humans we're better than this. But right now, we're suffering the consequences of a technology we didn't really understand, making these human traits worse. So that's where we are at the moment. I'm not sure if it's a very good answer. It's a depressing answer, but yeah. Hello.
Hi. I have a question. So you mentioned misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation as 3 categories of people that we need to combat. Mm-hmm. And what I wanted to ask is, when we are in a real-world situation, like, how do we deal with those 2 types of problems? Are the differences in how we deal with each of those 3 categories? Or?
Yes, yeah, that's a really excellent question. And I skimmed on the information. There's a few models you can use, and it depends on context. So for example, I would say you're sitting with a family member, right? And the family member says something, and you happen to be an expert in that area, and they're saying they read something and it says this, right? Or they send on a WhatsApp group, you get a message. You know, we all have this, right? We all have WhatsApp groups where family members send us mad things. Go, you're a scientist, is that true? And you're like, Christ on a bike. But the fact that they're asking is such a good starting point. So that's one situation where you have people that really want to know. And I think most people do want to know. Most people they're a bit scared, and they go, and they trust you. That's why they're asking. In that situation, you have a lot of power, right? But you can lose the power very easily by going, what I sometimes do, oh, shut up, that's so dumb. Because then the person is not going to ask you again, and you've shut down the avenue. If you go, that's a really interesting thing, yeah, where did you hear that? Okay, well, what we believe is this, and the reason we believe this is this. They've actually asked you for a conversation. They may not have said it explicitly. They have. And what you do then is you have a wonderful opportunity to sow seeds, where you go, yeah, and you can sow a lot of seeds. You go, that information resource is actually, it's not very good. They often put things up that are false. And the reason that's false here is this. And this is what the UNICEF model of combating misinformation is. You lead with the fact and go, that's not actually true. And then you explain the disinformation, explain where it comes from, and you end with the fact again. So that's one model of doing it. But with discussion, you have so much power. So if you have a situation in your personal lives, discussion is good. If you do outreach work, some of you have probably done it with the general public, they're also really interested. The other situation that you as scientists will find yourself in is the media are going to ring you sometimes. Your research is topical, or you're going to comment, right? You also have a great amount of power there. And you'll often deal with journalists who are like, is this going to kill us all? And you have to say, no, it's not. But it's really interesting where you think that comes from. You have two things. You have the personal conversations. The thing that I would warn people against, though, is occasionally you'll be walking, depending on what area you work in, you'll occasionally have people that pretend they want to have a discussion, but they actually just want to shout at you and abuse you. I made the mistake for years of wasting time with those people. I'd much prefer to discuss with family members or friends of the concerned public than with some jackass who is never going to listen and just wants to shout and say, I'm fighting with a scientist and putting it on my X profile. So I think you have a lot of different opportunities. I think scientists are so trusted. That 61% of society trusts science. That's the good news. I'm trying to find good news in a sea of bad news, but that's the good news. I hope that's kind of useful. But you have more power than you think. So I will say for all of us, we have more power than we think.
Hi, David.
Hello.
Well, I really, I'm shocked by, not really shocked because we already knew these type of things, but I'd like to talk more to you later on. But just one question or sharing a comment. I mean, concerned about what you told us, I wonder how come, or maybe we should push for one day to have, at the constitutional level, the so sacred, freedom of expression, equal to the level of freedom for knowledge access, for the truth, I mean, the truth. So, in Mexican's constitution, the freedom of expression is limited to the extent of moral whatever. But there's no, legal way, as far as I know, to support putting a stop to all these amazing amounts of lies that, who was that said, one lie repeated 1,000 times becomes a truth? Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And philosophically, that's the illusory truth effect, absolutely.
So that's the question. I mean, I know it would be very, even dangerous to say, truth is at the constitutional level, and then it might be also, you can also imagine of a sort of authoritarian system that will claim to have the truth of everything. But anyway, that's the question.
This is a brilliant question, and I love it. And this is the kind of question I discuss over beers a lot. So if anyone's around later, there's two things to distinguish. So there is a tension, some people say, between freedom of speech and you see people spreading misinformation. But I always think that freedom of, and we have it in the Irish Constitution too, but freedom of speech and freedom of expression simply means the government can't arrest you for having your opinion or your belief, which they shouldn't. This should be sacrosanct. Even if your opinion is wrong, even if your belief is disgusting or wrong, you should be allowed to have that. But the problem with the social media era, and I keep coming back to social media because I think this is a major part of the modern problem, is that people confuse freedom of expression with freedom of a platform, right? If I, for example, I'm thinking of the most popular incel influencer in the world, Andrew Tate, right? He says misogynistic, terrible things to a huge platform. He's entitled to have those views, but should he be rewarded with a platform? In the old days, newspapers, if you had racist or sexist views, they would say, no, we're not going to give you a column. Now we can do it on social media. So we have to distinguish between freedom of speech and freedom to a platform. And I think that balance is hard to get. But there's also freedom from consequences of speech. If I ran into this room and I yelled, there's a fire outside. This is the classic philosophical problem, the freedom of speech. I yell, there's a fire, and maybe we get injured trying to get out, right? Am I responsible for the harm I've caused you with my free expression? And that's a really deep, it's deeper than I can answer today, and that's the ideological tension. But the second part of your question, I think, is really important. The freedom of knowledge, you said that. I think is a beautiful way of saying it, right? We should be giving people knowledge. And we should be giving people access, but not just knowledge, like here's a bunch of facts. And this is why I love critical thinking so much. Here are the tools that we use to interrogate facts and to come to conclusions, and they're not democratized yet. One of my favorite websites in the world, and one of the few good things on the internet, is Wikipedia. Right? I know people, I know a lot of you lecture and you say to your students, don't just go to Wikipedia. I say to my students, start on Wikipedia. Don't you dare finish there, but start there and check the references and do this. Because it's an attempt to democratize access to information, to knowledge. And of course, we need something like that for the tools, not just that information, but the tools to analyze that information. So I think the second part we could work positively towards as scientists We could work towards, look, that transparency that science demands is something I love about science. We don't just show, here's our answer, the universe or the earth is round. We show how we got there. We show our working, and we show where we might be wrong. We have the humility to go, look, on the best version of my model, the earth is round, but it might be wrong because science is always provisional. We can democratize that and make people realize that all truths that you deal with in society, I feel this way, I support this president today, but maybe, if this happens, I'll change my view. That freedom, and we need to get there. And it's such a, do you know what, if you're around for a few beers later, this is what I could talk about all day, but I'll stop there because I could go on forever, sorry.
We have a couple of questions from the online audience.
Oh, the internet.
Nebulous audience. Actually, both questions are from Irving Simonin, a PhD student in our lab. And the first question is, if you know if there's any work on any country on redesigning academia incentives to reduce publishing pressure. And the second one is, what was your Dublin nickname?
All right, no, they're both excellent. Well, the second one maybe not so much because it's probably embarrassing. So the very first one, there isn't, and that's what shocks me, because there's a little bit of an unwillingness, and we all know, if we all sit down and talk, we all know the current model is not very good. We all know, we all discuss papers that we saw in big journals that we know are garbage, right? That we don't trust, that we won't even cite because we don't trust them. But the idea of a scientific record should be, this is the best with the tools we have, this is the most confident we are about this, with all, and at the moment, because and I blame universities for this too. How many of you get assessed by your university for how many papers you have out in big journals, yeah? Me too, right? And here's the thing about that. They're setting up a perverse incentive. The paper I did with John in 2018 was on perverse incentives. If you say, hey, the more you publish, and journals, by the way, are for profit. This is most of them are. Like, there's a crazy history of why journals became the most lucrative business in the world. If you have shares in Elsevier or Springer Nature, they don't pay for any of the labor. I mean, you did all the labor. They don't pay for the review. You did all the review. And the funding for that came from institutional and national funders. All they do is put it into a bit of paper. And usually they put it in with loads of typos that they didn't bother to correct because they expected you to correct them too. And then they charge you $10,000. Thank you, Nature. Fantastic. But here's the thing, that's a wrong model. So there are people trying to change that. And I mean, eLife was an attempt, and they're having that experiment at the moment. Plus all those kind of things. There is an attempt to democratize that and say, look, all results matter. We should be talking about results that we trust, and the method should matter. But are countries themselves actually taking this seriously? I think academia isn't even taking this seriously. Like, I still feel that we're a little bit in denial. I would say I talk about this a lot, and Daniela will tell you, she's heard me harp on about this so often. I would say when you talk to scientists about this, about 2/3 of them will go, yeah, it's a real problem. And there's 1/3 that will get so offended at the idea you would suggest that science isn't perfect. And that 1/3 are the problem for the other 2/3, and the problem for institutions and natures. We have to grasp the nettle and say, we can do better. And we deserve for our own, like, how many times have you gone through a paper, tried to replicate it, doesn't work, and you've wasted, a chunk of your grant? A lot of us have that experience. We should go towards a world where that happens less. It would benefit everyone. But yes, you're right, a national endeavor. If anyone wants to do that, I'm all ears to help out, because that would be great. As to the second part of the question, nicknames, I'm trying to think of the ones I'm allowed to say in public, because some of them are quite, Jesus, no. Nothing exciting. I got called Quentin for a few years, which is weird because I sounded British. And they assumed Quentin was the most British name. So, all right, Quentin, what's the story with you, lad? I'd moved back from the Middle East and I sounded more British than the average Irish person for a while. That's the only polite one I can tell you. The rest of them, you'll have to get me a beer and I'll talk about it then. So, hello.
So if you'll allow me to abstract this a little bit.
Sure.
It seems like many of these symptoms are driven by a conflict between the desire to exercise some sort of executive function and an intolerance of ambiguity.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
My question is, and this is in part because I have a 5-year-old and I generally teach undergrads, right?
They're very similar, undergrads and 5-year-olds, I find there's a lot of overlap.
Is there a window, or is it known if there is a window in human development where there is some plasticity there, where there's an opportunity to address this in this sort of generational context. Because I think, to your last point, those scientists are adults and they won't change their mind. Kids can. Where is that space?
That is such a brilliant question. And it's something I really, I'm stealing research here. For many years, I went out with a psychologist, and her PhD area was aversion to randomness. So I stole so many of her notes. We're still very good friends, so she knows this. But I was like, you've actually asked a brilliant question. You said the lack of tolerance for ambiguity. And there's a psychological makeup. This was her research, and I mean, I did one or two papers with her on it, but it's really interesting because we start to develop that around very early ages. Now, I can't give you, I'd have to go back and read the notes on this. But essentially, this is the idea that leads us to a lot of conspiracy theories. So, for example, there's a lot of people that believe that Bill Gates caused the pandemic to sell vaccines. And that sounds quite sinister to most of us, right? But that to some people is easier to accept than the narrative that a randomly mutating wild virus suddenly became capable. The probabilistic reasoning that we have a lot of viruses mutating, some of them are going to be able to infect humans, that is too uncertain for some people. And they need a good, bad, and most conspiracy theories, when you break, and I do a lot of work in conspiracy theories too, when you break them down, they're very simple good versus bad narratives. And things happen for a reason all the time. They're always single cause, very clear. And real life isn't like that. So there is some interjection that you can stem this off at early childhood intervention where you get people more comfortable with ambiguity, but it's very early level research. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think that our need to have simple narratives, our need to not tolerate ambiguity, and science, by the way, is full of ambiguity. We report our results with uncertainties. We report them based on the experiment we did, knowing that other experiments might be more conclusive. We have to get comfortable with them too, as adults. But you're right, there is a level of development at some childhood stage where people tend to go towards a total rejection, but it seems to be cyclical as well. If I remember correctly, and I am going from memory here, but I will look this up and get back to you. Remember, it can be cyclical. Teenagers, for example, tend to be far more certain of the world, far more black and white. Then when they get a bit older in their teenage years, they become more shades of gray because they have more moral experience to realize things. But that's probably a moral one as well. The aversion to randomness is a real problem. And it's a real psychological drive that humans have. And we're not fully sure why. But you're right, if we could start editing that very early on and encouraging people to embrace uncertainty. And as a statistician, I love when we embrace uncertainty. That's great. And so that it's not lack of control. Sorry, I remember the word I was thinking of. It's called locus of control theory. People want control. And randomness feels like we're ceding control, but we're not. We're just saying we can control only a very small aspect of things. And I feel that's more liberating. So I think if we can reframe it as liberating to realize that there is uncertainty, we might be better off. But again, that's very early research. So thank you. It's a great question, but I'm sorry it's a crap answer.
Maybe liberating, but that's more work.
Yeah, absolutely. But yes, thank you. That was a really good question. And I will look that up for you because I'm going from memory and I don't trust my memory. I'm getting old. I don't trust my memory at all. So I think have I tortured people enough today? Thank you very much. Cheers.